This is Dan Abbott. I'm making this video for the CAD Management class at Southern Maine Community College. I want to show you some things that I would recommend highly that you do when you first install AutoCAD. But before we get there, I want to look in Options in AutoCAD. And when you look in the Options command, it allows you to take a look at where files are saved. Well, there's an important file that gets saved called an automatic save file. And if you open that up, it tells you that it's going to be saved on the C drive in a folder called Users, your name, app data, local temp, which means if you need that file, which has an SV $ extension, you need to be able to find it. Now, oftentimes, if one is created, AutoCAD will tell you that when you open it the next time and allow you to go and open the file, but it doesn't always work. Sometimes you have to go there directly. Here's the problem. I'm going to go to Windows, and I'm going to open up the File Manager. And under View, you notice that there's some areas over here, File Name and Extension and Hidden Items, that are not checked off. I recommend highly that you check them off, and here's why. If I go looking on the C drive, under Users, and under Users I go to the location specified in AutoCAD. Go back and just remind you of what that is. That location specified for the automatic is Users, the user's name, app data, local temp. Pay attention to app data. So now I go in here, that's my name. I'm looking for the app data folder and it's not there. Now if it's not there, I can't open it. Now I can get to it directly by typing it in here, but if I say show me hidden items, suddenly app data shows up. It's right there, slightly grayed out. There are other files that will also be hidden if you don't do that. When you're dealing with managing your software, you have to be able to see those folders. So when you go to App Data and open it up, Local shows up, you can go in and you can find that file. The other problem is this. For instance, right here, there's a text document, but you notice there's no extension shown because by default, Windows won't show you extensions. I do that, now it has an LOG extension. There are a number of other files here that we're going to have to deal with in AutoCAD, and those files are going to have different extensions even though they're all going to be text files. So down here, you've got a text file here, a TXT file. Well, without doing that, it doesn't tell you it's a TXT file. And in AutoCAD, if you modify something or edit a file like the ACAD LIN or the ACAD PAT, the ACAD PGP files, they're all text files, but you won't be able to save them with an extension because it'll automatically get a TXT extension unless you do this, where you can then modify the extensions. So that's number one. Number two, there are some real problems with this floating toolbar, floating command line, I mean. I don't like it, and I don't like it in part because I've been using AutoCAD since 1988, but it also changes the way fundamentally coordinates work. And so I want to have one system for entering coordinates. So in order to do that, I'm going to have you do several things. One is I'm going to grab this by the end, and I'm going to drag it down and dock it. That means I bring it down until it changes into that. Then I'm going to make mine a little bit bigger. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger because I want to see more than just a couple of lines. I'm now going to move it to the top. Now you can do anything you want with yours. The reason I put mine on the top is because that's the way I normally teach. Because if I'm doing a presentation with an overhead projector, actually these days it's more likely to be a large format monitor, I'd like people to be able to read it. At the top it's usually easier to read, but the text is a little bit small. And actually at 74, I'd like that text to be a little easier to read myself. I'm going to go back into Options, and in Options under Display, I'm going to do several things. One is I don't like the contrast to the dark color theme, so I'm changing that from dark to light. Under Colors, I'm going to change the background color from black, which I don't like. White is one color that I often use when I'm presenting, but you can also go and select, don't ever select True Color or anything over here for color books in AutoCAD. Always do index colors. Why it shows up in True Color, I'm not sure. It is possible for you to end up with a sort of a different shade of gray then, so maybe that's why. And in this particular case, it's not a big deal, but do not use any of these colors in the drawing in AutoCAD because now when you check monochrome when you're plotting, it will not be black and white, it'll be what those colors are. So I'm going to go to an index color and I'm just going to pick that as a background. Now I also am going to apply this. Now the background color is light. If I go over to fonts, I can change this font size, and I actually prefer Lucinda Console. And I can change the font size from 10 to 14. And now it's a little easier for me to read what's in the command line. Pick OK. And the gray background's a little easier on the eyes. The contrast up here, I think it's easier to see what I'm doing. Now, some students like the gray background when I'm teaching. Some students don't. One thing I don't like is the fact that the cursor ends up being white on a gray background. So I can also change the color of that cursor. And if I do that, I just go and say, what should my crosshairs be? Black. What I'm actually going to do is change the uniform background color to white. And that's just to give it the highest contrast possible so that it's easier to see what I'm doing right now. Now, there are a couple other things. That grid, I've been using AutoCAD since 1988. I've never used that grid for anything. I've used the snap option on occasion for doing things like laying out schematics, but or piping and instrumentation drawings, but never the grid. It's just in my way. I'm going to press the F7 key and get rid of it. The other thing that makes no sense to me is that we're looking at a workspace called drafting and annotation, i.e. two-dimensional work, and that's what we're going to be using AutoCAD for the most part. This is a 3D option. And what will happen on occasion is people will be working in this area and it's kind of in the way, and the next thing they know, they select something like that corner and they're looking down in 3D at what they're trying to draw. I don't want any 3D controls, and those are both 3D controls. This one, the nav bar, has a little X in it, just like most things do, where you can close it. This one does not have a little X in it. That X closes the drawing. So you have to type nav cube, and you'll see something else, which I'm going to change, which is that we have dynamic input. Dynamic input shows up at the cursor. Some people like it, especially when they first start. You get all this stuff showing you what the angles are. They give you all this information. Most serious users or power users do not use that. It also changes the way that coordinates are entered. So I'm going to get rid of that as well. But for right now, I'm going to type nav cube. I'm going to turn that off and get rid of it. Now, the nav cube will still show up in a layout. So I'm going to have to go and turn it off in there as well. Get rid of that. And since there are two layouts set up here, it shows up in each one of them. Now, once I turn it off, what happens when I make a new layout and double click? Well, the new layout, when I go into it, has the nav cube in it as well, which means I'm going to have to turn it off in every layout. This makes no sense to me. Why they did that, I don't know. But what I don't want is to open up a drawing starting with a template file and automatically having those things show up. So I want my layouts to start without having the nav cube open. I'm actually just going to delete that one, because once you get rid of it, it's gone. Now, well, let's talk about the dynamic input. Dynamic input should have a button down here to get rid of. What we have here are some buttons that I personally never use, and not all of these buttons are usable, and some things that I want are not on this little status bar. Over in the right-hand corner, 3 little dot lines. If I open that up, it'll allow me to go in and say, gee, I don't really want my grid on and off, or my snap mode on and off, because I don't use them. Ortho mode, I certainly don't want to turn that on. Polar tracking, I do want. Isometric drawings, I don't, unless I'm doing piping schematics. Object snap tracking, absolutely. 2D object snap, absolutely. But I also want to control my line weight, so I'd like to see that button. For now, I want to see the dynamic input button, which is right here, because I want to turn dynamic input off. Dynamic input shows up here. I can turn it off. Now I'm going to go back and get rid of that button. Now, could I have just typed DIN mode? Yes, or DIN IP mode, I could have, but it's hard to remember what that command is, so I just turned it off there. Now I have the thing. Well, there's one other thing I want. I'd like to have coordinates showing when I'm working, so I can just glance down and see where my mouse is. Units is not a bad thing to have either. So, right now it's indicating we have decimal units, and that's a pretty nice way to go and change things. Oh, isolate objects that I like, and clean screen on and off. It's funny, I thought that would be nice. It kind of cleans the screen, gives you the maximum amount of space on your monitor. Maybe because I have large monitors now, I don't really care. But other than that, oh, quick properties, kind of nice to have it turn on and off, although I usually like it on. And selection cycling. Those are the things that I would put on. And then I would leave it like that. Now, again, the white background I'm using because it has high contrast right now. You might prefer a gray background to kind of make it easier on your eyes, but you know how to change that now. And you might even like the dark theme. Whatever you care, whatever you want, whatever works the best for you is fine. But getting rid of the grid, getting rid of the nav cube, getting rid of the nav bar allows me now to do a save as. And I'm not going to save this as a drawing file. I'm going to come down here and save it as a template file. And I'm going to replace the AutoCAD DWT file with what I have now. So when I start a new one, it looks like that. And as long as I'm doing that, let's go ahead and go to the Start button. And let's start a new file with the AutoCAD ISO template, because you need to have a distinction when you create your template files between drawings you'll do in inches, AutoCAD.DWT or Imperial, and drawing you do in millimeters, AutoCAD ISO, International Standards Organization. Open that up. You can see it's got the same problems I have in the other one. My nav cube, turn it off. Now I've got the command line coming up. I would go into the two layouts that show up by default and do the same thing. Start that. Nav cube. By the way, just start typing and nav cube shows up. And then I can turn that off. And then go to this one and do the same. There are other changes I would make to my default template as well. But for right now, nav cube. Yeah, for right now, those are the changes I would make. And I'm going to go and do a save as. The thing, by the way, I would do is turn the menu bar on. The menu bar has a couple of things on it. Set it to 1, it turns on. That's that pull-down menu here. I would much rather have the pull-down menu than the ribbon, to tell you the truth. And in fact, normally when I'm working with AutoCAD for real, I just close the ribbon up like that. So, but give me this, because under the Edit button, you've got things called Copy with Base Point and Paste as Block that are helpful when you're dealing with multiple drawings and you're moving back and forth. You can always open the ribbon by doing this if you want to see it again. I'll leave it open for now. But again, this is not something that you save in a drawing file. This is something that gets saved in the CUI with a workspace. In fact, let me show you something about workspaces in a minute. So now I'm going to do a save as. Now the reason I like to pull down is because if you go to the pull down menu under File, Save As shows up here. It doesn't show up, well, I'll talk about this later. So I'm going to do a save as on this as well. Once again, I'm going to save it as a template file. This time it's the AutoCAD ISO file. So I'm going to replace that one. So now every time I start either one of those, it's not going to have the grid on. It's not going to have the nav cube. Now an actual template, and I'm going to go through and show you what I would set up for a template. An actual template, in my opinion, should have layers in it. It should have layouts set up. It should have a dimension style set up. And anything that you would use in every single drawing should be available to you as blocks, including in my, I think, a title block, although some companies will externally reference title blocks in so they can manage them later on. The problem with an XRF title block is if you send this drawing to somebody else, you're going to have to send them both the title block drawing and the drawing that you've done. So now I don't want to do any more editing on these. I don't want to accidentally save something as a template. So I'm just going to get rid of that. I'm going to get rid of this. It goes back to the Start menu. Now I can say, let's make a new drawing. Let's start with the AutoCAD. So I'm going to go the AutoCAD DWT file, and you'll notice when it starts up now, no grid, no nav cube, nothing in the layouts either. Now, what else should be in a template file? Well, layers should be in a template file, and you've done a lot of work with layers in other classes. The thing I want to go over right now, though, is dimension styles. So let's start with a mechanical dimension style. If I type the letter D, dimension styles come up. Neither of those is an adequate dimension style. None of them meet standards. And by the way, AutoCAD is horrible at meeting ASME standards. ASME stands for American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Those are the standards that most manufacturers in the United States adhere to. So why Autodesk has never determined that it's a good idea to actually meet those standards in the defaults, I don't know. But we're going to throw both of those away. well, not necessarily throw them away. I'm going to go up, well, let's come down here. I'm going to rename standard. And standard can be renamed here. It cannot be renamed in a style, a text style. I'm going to call this mechanical. And I'll just call it mechanical. So I could say imperial. I'm just going to say inch instead. So it's measuring in inches. Up here, I'm going to right click on that and I'm going to delete it. So the only style I want is the one called mechanical inch. Now I'm not going to make that annotative right now. This is sort of a new thing with me, and this has to do with a problem that was introduced. Well, it's a problem that's always been with AutoCAD Centermark, but Autodesk introduced a new command called Centermark, which was just horrible. Absolutely never use the AutoCAD Centermark tool. And there's very good reasons for that. But before I go through and show you why I'm saying that the way I did, let's just show you what the main problem is. There's two circles. I go and I type center mark, thinking that's going to be a good idea. And it says, yeah, great. Put a mark here, put a mark here. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers, which publishes standards for things like technical drawings, requires that center marks be uniform in size. The problem is that center mark is big because the circle is big. That one's small because the circle is small. That is not the standard. So that is a horrible tool. It also gives you a center mark that you cannot quite get rid of the extension lines on. You can change them. You can make them longer and shorter. You can do that. But you can't bring them all the way back or get rid of them altogether. They're just one entity. As a center line tool, it's a little better, but the center mark tool should never be used. There is a command called dim cen, or dim center, which actually allows you to put a center mark on. And that center mark is something you can set the size for, and it's always the same size. Not the right size, but it's always the same size. So what I want is to be able to put a center mark in. But I also want that center mark to be something that scales automatically with the layout. So if I go into a layout, and I say, oh, I've got to have this layout set up for 1:2 scale. Just barely does it. Just make that a little bigger. Now when I put a center mark in, the center mark is going to be twice as big as it was before if I set my dimension style up properly. The problem is when I say that, it's not I'm going to make the center mark annotative because that is not possible. Instead, I want the center mark to scale automatically to the layout that the center mark is placed in. So let's go back to the dimension style. And I have a handout that shows you exactly how to do this. I'm not going to use the handout right now. You can go ahead and reference the handout as I'm going through. I'm going to leave that as a non-annotative style. And I'm going to go and modify some things. And these are all modifications to make the dimension style meet the ASME standards. First, baseline spacing, 0.25, not 0.38. Extension lines should not extend 0.18. They should extend about a 1/16 of an inch, which is about 0.06. 1/16 is actually 0.0625, but that doesn't really matter. The offset from origin, that's that little gap between the extension line and whatever you identify. Just for simplicity or consistency's sake, I'm going to set that to 0.06 as well. Otherwise, everything else here stays the same. Symbols and arrows. Well, closed filled has a problem, and that problem is a glitch in AutoCAD that's been around for at least a dozen releases. I don't know why it's never been corrected, but I'm going to give you some advice about setting up a radial dimension style. And unfortunately, the closed filled arrowhead will disappear sometimes when you do that. So I'm going to go and pick Open 30 as my arrowhead style. And by the way, you can create your own arrowhead if you want, which I do because I like it to have a little curve to it, but that just means making a block. Arrowhead size, that's way too big. 0.1 to 0.12 is the standard. Center mark size, also way too big. Make that 0.06, which actually is the distance from where they cross to the end. That 0.06, excuse me, will end up with a center mark that's about 1/8 of an inch on either side. By default, I want lines placed, and those lines would be extension lines. Now, the AutoCAD Center Mark tool, the new one, which is so bad because the center mark changes size, that has extension lines by default, but we don't want to ever use it. We want to use the AutoCAD's old-fashioned center mark tool, the dim center tool. And so this size is going to give me the size that I want on that, and I want it to draw lines. Only, though, when I place a center mark. Now I go to text. Standard is not a good name to use. In fact, standard annotative, and I think ISO _25 and metric should never be used for anything. You cannot get rid of the standard, and you cannot rename it because it gets used in complex line types by name, and so if you got rid of it, your line types wouldn't work. So I want annotative text. I don't want it to be called annotative, though. I want it to be called something else, and something else in my case would be the name of the font that it's based on. AutoCAD, by default, these are both based on Arial. Arial is pretty close to meeting ASME standards, but it's a little heavy from my point of view, and it's not exact in a couple of cases. But you can use it if you'd like, but if you're going to use it, then change the name Arial -Anno, so we know that that is an annotative style and it's based on the Arial font. That to me is safer than calling it annotative. Now, why should you never use those? Because when you combine drawings from somebody else, another department in the place you work, another company, they might be using those names, but they might be defined differently. And if you put two drawings together, only one of them can be used to define what standard means. So we don't ever want standard to be used for anything or annotative. Now, I personally don't care for the Arial style. What I would prefer is something called simplex _IV25, and calling it that doesn't change anything. I'll make it annotative here, so I need to go and find it. So I'm going to go and find the simplex IV_25. Looks like that, and that is very close to the standard and the drafting standard as well. There are some other things. Sometimes I use something called GD&T, which doesn't have any lowercase letters, but it does have some symbols that are geometric dimension and tolerancing symbols. At one time, there was no taper symbol. There might still not be a taper symbol in AutoCAD. In which case, then maybe what I'd want, save that one, and I got a new one. Maybe I'd call this GDT, Anno, come back out, and that one, GD&T, would be right here. There's one called GDT IV25 that's also, actually I would, on this, well, it's funny, there's a little bit of a difference here. The SHX fonts will take up a little less memory, but that's not a big deal anymore. The TrueType fonts are raster-based fonts instead of vector-based fonts. I think I might use this one because I think it looks a little better. What happens is this, though. You get uppercase letters only, which is what you normally want in a drawing. And then the lowercase letters are replaced with symbols that are used for geometric dimension and tolerancing. So those are possibilities. You might not need that one, but in particular, the conical taper symbol used to be missing. It might still be. I haven't checked in the current release. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this as my current style. Now, the whole point of this is back in the dimensioning. I don't want standard. I want something that looks better. So I'm going to go with simplex _IV25. Again, you could go with that, which makes it a little bit heavier. But any of those is fine because they come very close to meeting standards. Text size should never be that big. 0.1 to 0.12. 0.12 is the traditional. 0.1 is what I normally use because it allows you to put more. Actually, I'm going to go with 0.1. 0.1 allows you to get your dimensions tight, a little more tightly in there. Offset from line is how much space you have between the line and the dimension. 0.09 I think is too much. 0.04 allows you to get dimensions in there a little better. And as long as I'm changing the the text height to 0.1, let's change the arrowhead size as well. You don't want to be any smaller than that because when you print something out and then maybe sometimes reduce it, it gets very hard to read. Now, under fit, either text or arrows, AutoCAD makes really bad judgments in my opinion sometimes. Generally speaking, if there's not enough room for both the text and the arrows, you put the arrows outside, not the text. So that's what I'm going to do here. Over here, normally I would pick annotative, but for the parent style in this case, I'm picking scale dimensions to layout because that'll scale the center marks. And now I'm going to make every other type of dimension an annotative dimension. Nothing else changes down here. Primary units are going to be decimal for mechanical drawings. Precision, 4 decimal places is unusually high precision unless you're dealing with classes of fit. Most of the time, 3 decimal places, and that's as many decimal places as you'll see with a tolerance in the title block. Therefore, I would change that to 3 decimal places, excuse me, and leave it there. You always suppress leading zeros for drawings that are done in inches. And under angular dimensions, because so many people have misunderstood an angle as being correct when it's set to precision of 0, because now if you happen to have an angle of 29.5, it'll be rounded to 30 and look correct. So I usually do that. Even better, just go up higher, but then get rid of trailing zeros when you put angles in. And now, if it's not 30, you'll know that it's a smaller number than that. That's all I would do for the parent style. Now all we have to do is start creating child variations. So we'll go to New again. Down here, we're going to go and pick every single one of these. Linear dimensions, and we're going to make them annotative. Now, linear dimensions, I'm not going to change anything that I had here before other than annotative. Now I'm going to go and do every single type of dimension so that I can say angular dimensions, we want those to be annotative. And it always comes out like this. Then we go and say New. Okay, now we have radius dimensions and diameter. So let's let's take care of ordinate and liters first. So I just make those annotative just to get them out of the way. Now the new one, and that's going to be for liters, because there are a couple of changes in diameter and radius that I would have you make. And now we just do this. Okay, now what I'm going to do is to finish this out with the radius and the diameter. Now, just to show you why, let me just close this out, why we're going to make a variation. If I were going to do a diameter dimension on here right now, the way it's set right now, it's going to go right in the middle. If I were to do a radial dimension on this, the way it goes right now, also it's going to go inside. Well, I might want it inside, but I also might want it outside. So I don't care for the fact that I have to make some changes here. Let me get rid of those center marks too. I'll show you why in a bit. Okay, so now I'm going to go back. So for New, for radial dimensions, and again, the reason why the parent style is not annotative is strictly so that center marks come in the right size. So now we want that to be annotative, and we want this to be for radial dimensions. We're going to continue. Now we're going to start with lines. We're going to suppress extension lines so that we can put a radial dimension in without automatically having an extension line if AutoCAD decides that it needs one. Everything else stays the same. Symbols and arrows, we do not want a center mark placed. We're going to place those independently. We don't want it to be part of the dimension, so I'm going to say none. We go to text, nothing changes here. Under fit, not the arrows that go outside, both text and arrows, and we're going to put them over the dimension line with a leader, and we're going to place the text manually. And dimensioning scale is going to be annotative. Now, primary units, nothing changes there. So we get done. Now we have radius, and it's also annotative. Now we go back over and, not modify, sorry, New. Go back over to New on this one, and for this one what I want is diameter dimension. Continue that. The diameter dimension is also going to be changed in the same way. So I have the diameter style, and I'm going to start with symbols and arrows. I'm going to say don't put a center mark in for that either. Then under fit, we're going to say the arrows, both text and arrows. We're going to leave this one beside the dimension line. The reason for changing that in radial is to fix a weird little glitch where if you do that and then you put a certain type of radial dimension in, the filled in arrowhead disappears. So anyway, I've got, if you can bring this down. Well, actually, if you do that, it doesn't come out right. It just looks really funny. But if you use a filled arrowhead and change this, it disappears. So we want this to be annotative, and we want to place text manually. So now what that allows us to do is this. Everything is annotative accept the center mark. So when I put in a center mark using DCE, it comes in independently and looks like that. Pulling in over here, it looks like that. They're the same length, but I can edit it easily, which you can't do with the AutoCAD center mark. So if I wanted to put a linear dimension that went from the end of that crosshair to the end of this one, now I have, I meant to lock that and did not. So I have the crosshair scaling automatically, which is what you want. It then allows me to go to the end of the crosshair instead of the center of the circle so that I maintain the gap around the crosshair, but not going to the end of an extension line because you don't want a gap there. Now, just to show you what the difference is, and then we're going to go back. All right, so now if I were to put another viewport in here, and that viewport was scaled at MV, what's going on? Yeah, that viewport was scaled at 1:1 instead of 1:2, which is what I have that one. Let's say 1:4. Now you notice that center mark right there is way too small, but if we put a center mark in while having the layout, you notice it comes in the right size because the center mark is in fact being scaled. Now it's not annotative, which means you don't have the same kind of control. But you see how it looks too big here, but it's based on the viewport that you put it in. Now, the problem over here, and let's just get rid of all that stuff. If you put a radial dimension in, you want that radial dimension to be placed like this, or you want it to come out here like that. It just doesn't work if you don't make the changes that I showed you. Now, the fact that there's no extension line here, I like that. If you need an extension line, then you can just go change that in properties. But most of the time, I want a radial dimensions on the inside arc that looks like this. On the outside arc, I want it to look like that, one or the other. If I do a diameter dimension, I want it to look like that. Or if I go inside, I want it to look like this. So this just allows me now to have dimensioning that works most of the time with that one dimension style. So that takes care of text styles, it takes care of dimension style. You know how to put layers in, so I would put the layers in as well. I'll show you a couple of other things I would do just from an interface point of view. But the other thing, and this is something that people disagree about, in fact, my colleague Paul doesn't like this idea. He and I disagree with it. You know, he does not want title blocks to be in a layout in your template file, because that's what I'm doing right now is creating my template file. I think it makes sense to put them there. So, you know, one thing you will understand is that if you're working for somebody else, you'll do things the way that somebody else tells you to do it. But if you're managing people, you decide what is the best way for people to do certain things that are efficient and consistent. So what I would do is have a layout made up in advance, and I'd want that layout to have a different name. And I would probably name that, and it could be based on the actual what the content of the drawing is as opposed to layout 1. But for right now, I'm just going to give it a different name, which is A size. And for mechanical parts, we're likely to have an A size sheet. I'll do the same thing here, right click and change the name, and I'll call that B size. And those are the 2-page sheet sizes I'm most likely to use. But if you want a third one, go ahead and likely that would be a C size. You can, I have seen mechanical drawings on sheets as large as E. The problem with this one, though, is it's got the nav cube thing. So you're going to have to turn that off. Well, now it's gone. And by the way, we don't want any of this stuff in our template file, so I'm just going to get rid of that. So right now, we'd have the layers, we'd have the template file, we've got these things. So then I would go in and literally set up each one of these. I'd right-click, go to Page Setup Manager. I would modify this. And by the way, it's critical that you not mix the metric ACAD ISO and the imperial or inch ACAD.dwt. This is specifically done with the ACAD.dwt. And if I type units, it'll tell me that this is going to be measured in inches. If I go to the layout, that's where some of the really significant changes take place. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to modify it, and I'll just call it that. Now, monochrome is what you almost always see these drawings done at, so I'm going to go and say, make sure it's plotted in monochrome. Plotter basically is really based on what you have for a physical plotter. So because so many people have different plotters and printers, and some people have big printers and some people don't, everything you do for me is going to be a PDF file. So we're going to use PDF as the plotter. Now I like DWG to PDF, and there's another place where Paul and I differ. It's not a big disagreement. It doesn't matter one way or the other, but he uses AutoCAD PDF high quality. I don't see a whole lot of difference, so I tend to use this one. Now, ANSI stands for American National Standards Institute. That's really the ASME standards for sheet sizes. 11 by 8.5 is A size. But I would actually use ANSI Expanded. And ANSI Expanded A gives you a little more drawing room. And now that's all I would change here, and I'd come back out. Now I would bring in a title block that I know fits within the printable area, which is that dashed line right there. Now we have a number of title blocks that you have available to you that you can use, but I'm not going to guarantee, since the different faculty members have made them using different versions of A-size paper, I'm not going to necessarily guarantee that they'll work. What you want, though, is one that was done in inches. You want a different one that was done in metric. Don't try to mix them up. You should have a drawing file that is simply a title block. And I'll show you what one looks like, and then we're going to bring that in and bring this in to this drawing as a block. So here's some title blocks that we have in the department. Title block A size, inches, title block A size, metric, title block B size, inches, title block B size, metric. I've got one set up for portrait if you need something up and down. So this is A size, so we'll go and open up A size. Now I have zones on this, so there's what it looks like. Got the zones on the side. I'm just going to open that file. I'm not bringing it in here. I'm going to open that file. I'm going to check and make sure that it's what I want. Now this is an older one, so that means I am going to delete that. Double click this, and I'm going to change the name to the current standard, and the current standard no longer has an M at the end, but it does have the date, 2018, with a dash in between. So it's the ASME Y14.5 2018 standard. Everything else on this looks pretty good. So you can see, by the way, it has, it's the older one. That's the school name. This is normally filled in. I don't have it filled in because the color messes up. Here's one thing about this that is not right. Okay, let's take a look at this. I'm not sure why it's not, but we need a crosshair on here. So I'm just going to place a crosshair. I see, it's because the crosshair was too big. Make sure this is. So, because it's a small, yeah, that's exactly why it is. Okay, it is a small circle, and so the crosshair is too big to include everything here. So because I want it to look the right way as a symbol, this is not a drawing now, it's just a symbol. What I'm going to do is just clean that up a little bit so we have crosshair here. I'll get rid of those two things. Alright, so I want that to look like this, and then you can see that that also needs to be cleaned up a little bit as well. So I will copy this right here, and I'll bring it from here over to, this is literally a brand new install of AutoCAD, so I haven't set it up the way I really wanted yet, except for the things I already did to show you. Oops. What I want to do is to copy those, and this is going to end up being a block anyway when I bring it into another drawing. But one thing you'll notice is this. Okay, that's what the symbol should look like right there. So now I like what it looks like. And one thing you'll notice is that this is all individual lines. This is not a block. In fact, there should be no blocks in this drawing at all, and there are not. We're going to bring this into another drawing, but we want it to be a drawing file. So I want to see what this value is right there, 0.25. I'm going to move this. I'm going to move it. So that point right there is at 0.12, comma 0.12. Come down a little closer. That's because I know it's going to fit into the printable area better that way, and then we're going to find out if it does print. So now I'm going to save what I have there. So that is just a drawing file consisting of all these individual pieces. Now I'm going to go back to the template that I'm creating. I'm going to insert this. Now AutoCAD has a new insert command. Opens up over here. I have to say it is clunky. I'm not crazy about it. And as a result, I am going to do something else. Instead of the instead of the insert command opening up that tablet, I'm going to go DD insert because I find it's easier to use. Maybe it's just because I'm so used to it, but now I come over here to where we have the title block that I just created. And what I just did is that one right there. I'm going to bring that in. Now I'm going to just say put it at 0, 0, and that's where I want it to go. See how that works. So I'm just going to pick it like this. It comes in. So you'll notice that it doesn't quite fit. And it doesn't quite fit because there's a little paper gripper margin at the top and the bottom. We could probably reduce that. Probably. We can also move that to the center a little bit. So that's what I want to do right now. Is I want to edit this. But you also notice since I inserted a drawing, it came in as a block. And you can see why. Those things were a little tiny, but that is the symbol we want. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to edit this. I just need to know how much smaller it has to be. So basically, what is the distance from here down to about there? And that distance is a little under ½ an inch. So I'm going to go to the block editor. In the block editor, I'm going to edit this block. I'm going to stretch this so that it fits into the shape, into the area that I want. We'll go 0.5. Close the block editor. Save the changes. Now they fit inside. This kind of comes outside a little bit, so we'll move this block over a little bit so it's centered again right there. So that now we know is going to print because it's inside the printable area, but just to make sure, we're going to do a preview on it. Look at the preview. The preview looks good. Again, now we could, it's possible, and on a specific printer it would print all the way out to the edges. In other words, we could maybe have gone here under Plot Setup Manager. Instead of ANSI Expanded, we might have gone ANSI Full Bleed. ANSI Full Bleed gives you a lot more room and basically says, look, we can put this anywhere. Now, we would not have had to worry about changing the title block because it would fit on there as a full bleed. If your printer will print it the way that it looks, then go ahead and get as much space as you want. In fact, let me see what happens if I bring this in now and just stick it in place. Yeah. So that's the modified version of this. If I bring that, say, over here, we could probably go ahead and go back in and edit it and have it be, in other words, get rid of that ½ inch that we took out of here, go up to 0.5, and that probably would fit. This is what you do to make sure, and then I'd print it out on our printer to make sure it works. So once you've got that and it looks good, then I would go and do the same thing for B size and the same thing for C size. You might even want to put a viewport in here. If you put the viewport in, which didn't have one, I want it to be as large as possible, so I want it to fit in here. I also want to be able to select it, which is why I have cycling on, object cycling, which is turned off right now. Because then if you pick something and it's directly on top of something else, it says, hey, there's two things. Which one are you trying to pick? The block underneath or the viewport? And you can pick the viewport. So object cycling is quite nice. I wouldn't make it larger. That I've seen some people do that. Make it the same, just go drag it outside the entire sheet like that. Because now things can be printed in it, and you don't want that. You want to see only things that you would actually print. And, probably I would start by saying, let's say most of what we do is 1-to-1. Let's set it to 1-to-1 and lock the viewport. Now we've got it locked. And the only other thing I would do with that viewport, although this one's sitting on top of lines, I still want that on its own layer. So because I want that in its own layer, I'd make a layer called VP. I'd make the color of that yellow, and I would assign that to the VP layer. And then I would go and select the viewport, and I would put that on the VP layer. Now it's yellow, doesn't show up very well, but if I did a preview on this right now, it wouldn't show up if it were inside. It gives me everything I want to see right here. And because I've got my dimension style set up, if I start putting in my center marks, center mark looks good here, and I put that on the dimension layer, of course. They're nice and consistent. Again, don't do this. Don't go to the ends of these. This is what a lot of people do because there's not supposed to be a gap in that line. In fact, it's specifically prohibited from having breaks in lines unless they cross an arrowhead. So I would just go to the end of the crosshair when dimensioning in AutoCAD. Now that gives me the actual dimension, and it still looks the way it's supposed to look. Don't forget, of course, that should be on a layer that has thick lines. Okay, this video is now about 45 minutes long, but let's just to make sure there's no question about it, let's talk a little bit about layers. Layering conventions can vary depending on the office. But one thing I would want you to do, and you have to do in this class, is to make sure that you have line type and line weight controlled by layer. So something else